Have you ever felt the darkness watching you? Not just the silence of an empty hallway, but something alive, breathing down your neck. I'm a night shift nurse with 17 years of experience, and what I lived through in Ward 6 still haunts my nightmares. These aren't just stories. This is the truth that'll chill your blood. I don't talk about Ward 6. None of us do anymore, not after what happened. Hospitals are breeding grounds for ghost stories, whispered rumors of lost souls and restless spirits. But this isn't some tale spun to spook new nurses. This is my horror, carved into my bones from 17 years on the night shift. 3 years ago, they shut down Ward 6. The official story was budget cuts, cold, clinical, believable. But we knew better. We knew it started with Mr. Avery, a patient who should have walked out alive. He'd been with us for weeks, an older man, gruff but kind, recovering from a routine surgery. His pulse was steady, his chart clean as a whistle. Discharge papers were signed, his bag packed by the bedside. But then he died. It happened in the dead of night, when the hospital hums with an eerie quiet. Cardiac arrest, they said. The code team stormed in, crash cart rattling down the hall. I was there, hands trembling as I handed over the paddles. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, pupils dilated into black voids. His mouth hung ajar, locked in a silent scream that never came. The monitor screamed a flatline, a piercing wail that should have meant the end. Yet his skin, it was warm. Too warm, like a furnace burned beneath it, as if something refused to let go of his body even after life slipped away. We tried to shake it off. Death's part of the job. You harden yourself to it. But then it began. Subtle at first, like a shiver you can't explain. A call light flickered in an empty room, its orange glow pulsing in the dark. The air grew thick with a stench, antiseptic laced with something metallic, something rotten that clung to your throat. Patients started muttering, their voices low and shaky. "The man by the window," they'd say, pointing to drawn blinds that hadn't been touched. I'd check. Nothing there, just shadows playing tricks. Or so I told myself. Then the security guard quit. He'd been a tough guy, ex-military, not easily rattled. But one night, he sat pale-faced at the desk, replaying Ward 6 footage over and over. "Eyes," he muttered, barely audible, "eyes that stare." He wouldn't say more, just grabbed his coat and walked out, leaving his last paycheck on the table. I asked the others what he'd seen. They just shook their heads, lips tight. That's when I knew. Whatever was in Ward 6 wasn't staying quiet. It got worse. Late one night, the intercom crackled to life. I was at the nurse's station, scribbling notes under a flickering fluorescent light. The clock read just past 2 in the morning, a time when the hospital feels like a tomb. Then I heard it. My name. "Claire," the voice whispered, soft as a breath, but sharp enough to pierce the silence. My pen slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. "Claire, you let me die." The words slithered through the speaker, cold and accusing. I lunged for the panel, heart hammering. "Who's this?" I demanded, pressing the button so hard my knuckle whitened. Silence. Dead, empty silence. Then, a sound I'll never forget. Wet, rasping breathing, like someone drowning in their own lungs, echoing from the direction of Ward 6. The doors to that wing had been locked for months, bolted shut with rusting chains. But through the frosted glass panel, I saw it, a shadow, long and twisted, shifting unnaturally as if its limbs didn't bend right. I couldn't sleep after that. The next night, I forced myself to check the security footage. My hands shook as I rewound the tape, the grainy screen casting a sickly glow across my face. At the exact moment of Avery's death, 3:15 in the morning, the cameras in Ward 6 flickered. Static buzzed, then cleared. The bed in room 612, his bed was moving. Sheets rustled as if pulled by unseen hands. Then a figure sat up, faceless, hunched, its head tilting in jerky, broken motions. The monitor beside it blinked to life, showing a steady pulse, a rhythmic beep cutting through the silence. But no one was there. My breath caught in my throat as the figure turned, slowly, deliberately, toward the camera. And it smiled. A wide, impossible grin stretched across the void where its face should have been. I yanked the plug from the wall, the screen snapping to black, but my pulse roared in my ears like a freight train. I put in my transfer request the next day, scribbling it out with a trembling hand. They shut down Ward 6 a week later, sealing it off like a bad memory. But it didn't end. Sometimes, in the quiet of a late shift, I still hear IT, that slow, wet breathing drifting through the halls. My name, whispered from empty corners. A shadow at the end of the corridor, watching, waiting. I don't look back anymore. I can't. Because deep down, I know whatever took Mr. Avery didn't leave with him. It's still there in Ward 6, lurking behind the glass. This is hard to tell. Some stories cling to you, heavy and cold, like damp gauze you can't peel off your skin. My colleague Lily was one of those stories. She was the perfect nurse, quiet, diligent, the kind of person you'd trust with your life in the chaos of a night shift. She had this calm about her, a steady hand that never faltered, even when the ER buzzed with panic or the halls fell silent under the weight of death. But something changed in her, slow and insidious, like a shadow creeping across a room you don't notice until it's too late. Lily thrived on the night shifts. Most of us dreaded them. Those long, lonely hours when the hospital turned eerie, its sterile brightness fading into a dim, humming void. The fluorescent lights would flicker, casting jagged shadows on the linoleum, and the air grew thick with an unplaceable unease. But Lily? She came alive in it. She'd volunteer for the graveyard hours, her soft voice cutting through the stillness as she checked charts or adjusted IVs. At first, I thought it was dedication, the mark of a true nurse, but then I saw the signs, subtle at first, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. Her skin, once warm and rosy, began to pale, as if the color was draining out of her night by night. Her eyes darkened, sinking into hollows that swallowed the light. Her voice, once clear and steady, grew distant, like an echo from a room I couldn't find. It wasn't just her appearance. She stopped chatting during breaks, stopped laughing at the tired jokes we'd trade to keep sane. Instead, she'd sit silently, staring at nothing, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. I asked her once if she was okay. She just smiled, a thin, empty curve of her lips, and said, "I'm fine, Claire. Just tired." But I knew it was more than exhaustion. Something was pulling her away from us, from herself. Then she started going to the basement. That place, no one talks about it, not really. It's a forgotten corner of the hospital, a maze of old rooms locked away behind rusted doors, steeped in rumors no one dared confirm. Some said it was just storage, dusty shelves of broken equipment and expired supplies. Others whispered darker things, experiments gone wrong, patients who never left, a history buried under concrete and time. The air down there was always cold, heavy with the musty scent of neglect, and the lights barely worked, leaving long stretches of shadow that seemed to move when you weren't looking. We avoided it, made excuses to send someone else if supplies were needed. But Lily? She went every night. It started small. She'd slip away after rounds, her footsteps fading down the hall toward the stairwell. At first I thought she was sneaking a break, escaping the sterile glare of the wards, but she'd stay down there too long, 30 minutes, an hour, sometimes more. When she came back, she was different, detached, her eyes glassy, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was sleepwalking through her own body. I caught her once at the nurse's station, her uniform slightly damp, a faint smell of mildew clinging to her. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. She turned to me, that empty smile stretching across her face. "It's peaceful down there," she said, her words soft but weighted. "It's where I find the truth." Truth? What truth? I wanted to press her, but something in her stare stopped me. A hollow, unblinking look that made my skin crawl. Then Lily vanished. It was sudden, like a light snuffed out. One night she was there, drifting through her rounds with that eerie calm, and the next morning she was gone. No goodbye, no notice. Her locker was emptied out, just a few crumpled papers left behind, but her uniform still hung in the back, crisp, white, untouched, like a ghost of her former self. We searched the hospital, called her phone, even checked her apartment. Nothing. She'd evaporated into the air, leaving only questions. But she didn't leave. Not really. It started with the footsteps, soft, steady, the faint tap of old nurse shoes against the linoleum. I'd hear them late at night, pacing the empty halls when I was alone at the station. I'd turn, expecting to see her rounding the corner, but the corridor stretched dark and silent. Then came the lullaby. Her lullaby. A haunting, old-fashioned tune she used to hum under her breath when she thought no one heard. It would drift through the air, faint at first, then louder, wrapping around me like a cold fog. I'd freeze, my pen hovering over a chart, my heart thudding as the melody lingered, then faded into nothing. At night, I felt her, right behind me, a presence so close I could almost feel her breath on my neck. I'd spin around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but the hall was always empty. The other nurses noticed it too. They'd whisper about it in the break room, their voices low and nervous. "Did you hear the footsteps last night?" one would ask. "That song. It's her, isn't it?" another would reply. We'd laugh it off, call it a ghost story to scare the newbies, but no one dared say it loud. We were afraid of what it meant, afraid she'd hear us. I know what took her. Something in the basement claimed her, pulled her into its depths night after night until she couldn't come back. Maybe it was the silence she craved, or maybe it was something darker, something that whispered promises she couldn't resist. And it's still calling her. I feel it when I pass the stairwell, a pull that tugs at my chest, urging me to follow. Sometimes in the dead of night, I hear that lullaby again, soft and insistent, rising from below. I see her in my dreams, pale, hollow-eyed, standing at the basement door, her empty smile beckoning me down. I don't know what she found down there, what truth she chased, but I know she's still there, waiting, bound to the shadows of that forsaken place. And I fear one day, it'll call my name too. Some secrets should stay buried. There are things you're not meant to find, truths that coil in the dark like snakes waiting to strike. I learned that the hard way during a routine storage check, a task so mundane I'd done it 100 times without a second thought. The hospital was old, its edges fraying with age, and the storage rooms were its forgotten relics, tucked away in dusty corners where no one lingered. They were places of neglect, filled with chipped bed frames, outdated machines, and boxes of supplies no one bothered to catalog. I'd always felt a faint unease walking those halls, but that night, it was different. That night, I stumbled into something I can't unsee. It was late, the kind of late where the hospital feels more like a mausoleum than a place of healing. The wards were quiet, the patients asleep or too medicated to stir, and I was alone with the hum of flickering lights and the distant clatter of a janitor's cart. My supervisor had handed me a clipboard earlier, muttering about a missing shipment of gauze that might have been stashed in the far storage room. "Last door down the hall," she'd said, barely looking up from her coffee. I didn't argue. Night shift nurses don't get to pick and choose. So I went, my sneakers squeaking faintly on the worn linoleum as I ventured deeper into the hospital's underbelly. The door was ajar when I got there, just a crack, a sliver of darkness spilling out into the dim hallway. That wasn't unusual. Staff were careless sometimes, too rushed to lock up properly. But something about it made me pause, a prickle at the base of my neck, like the air itself was watching. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The room was what I expected at first. Shelves sagging under dusty boxes, a broken IV stand leaning in the corner, the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. But then I saw it in the middle of the floor, stark against the grime, symbols scrawled in blood. They sprawled across the concrete, jagged and chaotic, circled by half-burned candles that had long since melted into waxy stubs. The blood, if that's what it was, had dried to a rusty brown, but it glistened faintly in the weak light, as if it still held some life. The air shifted, growing heavy, pressing against my chest like a hand I couldn't see. I took a step closer, my breath shallow, and felt it, a pull, magnetic and cold, dragging me toward the center of those symbols. The shadows from the candles danced on the walls, twisting into shapes that didn't make sense. Elongated figures, claw-like hands, eyes that blinked and vanished. My heart thudded, loud enough to drown out the silence, but I couldn't look away. That's when I saw the journal, old, tattered, half-hidden behind a stack of crates. Its leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. I picked it up, my hands trembling, driven by some instinct I couldn't name. The words inside were faded, scratched out in a frantic hand, but I could still read them. It spoke of rituals, not to banish spirits, but to bind them. The writer, someone who'd worked here long before my time, described spirits trapped in the hospital's walls, its basement, its very foundation. They weren't at rest. They were alive, hungry, their presence pulsing through the building like a heartbeat. The rituals were meant to cage them, to keep them from escaping into the world beyond. But they craved company, the journal warned, souls to share their endless vigil. Each sentence tightened the knot in my stomach, the air growing colder, the shadows sharper. I dropped the journal, its pages fluttering to the floor, and stumbled back. I ran, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty hall, but it followed. The hospital changed after that night. Lights flicker now where they never did before, casting jagged patterns that make my skin crawl. Doors creak open in the dead of night, revealing nothing but darkness when I check. Whispers call my name, soft, insistent, slipping through the walls when I'm alone at the station. Claire, they murmur over and over, until I can't tell if it's real or in my head. In my dreams, I see the symbols again, etched in blood across my vision, and I feel breathing at my neck. Slow, deliberate, inches away but never close enough to see. Story 4. The Mirror in Room 3. 6 years at Mercy General, and I thought I'd seen it all. Patients muttering to invisible visitors, monitors flatlining only for the dying to gasp back to life. Those were just part of the job, shadows I'd learned to shrug off. Night shifts harden you, turn the strange into routine. But that night shattered everything I thought I knew. It wasn't just another shift. It was the moment I realized something in this hospital had been waiting for me all along. It happened on the 3rd floor, a wing that had been empty for weeks. Abandoned, or so they said. The hospital was in flux, renovations creeping through its bones, and the 3rd floor had been cleared out, its patients shuffled to brighter, newer wards. I'd been assigned there anyway, a lone nurse checking charts in a stretch of hallway that felt more like a crypt than a hospital. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and old antiseptic, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow. It was late, past 2 in the morning, when the quiet broke. A rustle, soft and fleeting, brushed against my ears. I looked up from my clipboard, peering down the corridor. Nothing, just closed doors and stillness. I told myself it was the wind, a draft sneaking through a cracked window. But the hairs on my arms stood up anyway. Then it happened. An alarm, shrill and urgent, blaring from room 312. My stomach twisted as I hurried toward it, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty hall. Room 312 was at the far end, its door slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking out. I pushed it open, expecting chaos, a patient in distress, a malfunctioning machine. But the bed was empty, the sheets tucked tight and neat, untouched since the last occupant left. The IV drip hung still, its bag full, the monitor silent. I frowned, checking the chart again. Mrs. Hernandez, post-op, due for discharge soon. She should have been there. My pulse quickened as I stepped back into the hall, scanning the dimness. The security cameras by the exit showed no movement. No one had left the floor. A cold draft grazed my neck, sharp and sudden. I whipped around, heart thudding, but the nurse's station sat empty, its flickering light mocking my unease. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and drawn out, barely louder than my own breathing. Shh. It came from inside the room. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move back toward 312. The bathroom door caught my eye, slightly ajar, a thin line of shadow breaking the sterile white walls. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to call security and walk away. But I nudged it open anyway, my breath hitching in shallow gasps. The bathroom was empty, no sign of life, just a cracked tile floor and a chipped sink. Then I saw the mirror. In its reflection, she stood behind me, a woman in a faded hospital gown, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow pits of black. Her lips moved, slow and deliberate, but no sound came, just a silent plea or curse I couldn't decipher. I spun around, my heel slipping on the tile, but the room was empty. Just me, alone. My chest tightened as I turned back to the mirror. My own face should have stared back, but it was her again. Closer now, her head tilted unnaturally, those empty eyes boring into mine. The air grew thick, pressing against my skin like a damp shroud. The bed beside me jolted, its wheels screeching across the floor as if shoved by invisible hands. The lights overhead dimmed, their buzz stretching into a high-pitched whine. The monitor flickered, then died, plunging the room into a suffocating hush. I bolted, nearly tripping as I fled into the hall, my breath ragged and sharp. Footsteps followed, soft, deliberate, tapping behind me on the linoleum. I didn't dare look back, just ran for the stairwell, the elevators too risky, too confining. My hands shook as I dialed security from the lobby, words tumbling out in a breathless rush. "Someone's upstairs," I gasped. "Room 312. A woman, I saw her." The guard's face darkened. "Third floor's been empty for a month," he said, turning his monitor toward me. The footage played, the hallway, silent and still. No sign of me running, no open doors. My papers sat scattered on the nurse's station desk, but I wasn't there. Then the feed jumped, static flaring. One frame froze. Her, standing at the hall's end, staring straight at the camera. I didn't sleep that night. I locked my bedroom door, checked it twice, and lay awake, the whisper echoing in my skull. Next morning my phone buzzed, a voicemail from the hospital's number. I pressed play, dread pooling in my gut. A voice crackled through, faint and far away. "Nurse." Then silence. I called back, but the line was dead. No ring, no answer, just a void. My skin crawled as I sat there, staring at the screen. It wasn't just a trick of the dark anymore. She knows me, my name, my face, my fear. The third floor's sealed off now, its doors locked tight, but I feel her still, in the static of a call, the reflection I avoid in every mirror, the footsteps that trail me home. Whatever she is, she's not done with me yet. Before college, I worked as a night porter. It wasn't a glamorous gig, hauling bedpans, mopping floors, shuttling equipment through a sprawling California hospital that had seen better days. But the pay was steady, and the quiet nights gave me space to dream about a future beyond the bleach-scented corridors. I was young then, barely out of high school, scraping together cash for tuition while the world spun on without me. The hospital was massive, a hulking beast of concrete and glass, its daytime bustle fading into an eerie stillness after dark. Most patients were too sick to leave or tethered to machines that beeped softly through the night. It was uneventful work, routine enough to dull the edges of my restless mind, until the night I stepped into the old wing. The old wing was a relic, shut down years ago, or so the story went. They said it was unsafe, that the floors sagged and the walls cracked, a structural hazard too costly to fix. It sat at the hospital's far end, a forgotten appendage sealed off behind double doors plastered with faded caution tape. The staff avoided it, their eyes sliding past it like it didn't exist. But every so often, someone would let slip a whisper, a half-spoken rumor about why it really closed. A fire that never made the papers, patients who vanished without charts, something older, darker, buried in the building's bones. I didn't buy into ghost stories back then. I figured it was just talk, the kind of nonsense bored night shifters cooked up to pass the hours. That changed when I was sent there. It was a Thursday, I think. The details blur now, but the cold dread stays sharp. My supervisor, a grizzled guy named Hank with a smoker's rasp, handed me a work order scratched onto a crumpled sheet. "Equipment drop," he said, barely glancing up from his newspaper. "Old wing, storage room past the locked doors. Take the cart, don't dawdle." I hesitated, the words "old wing" sinking like stones in my gut. "Thought that place was off limits," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. He shrugged, his cigarette glowing in the dim break room light. "Just don't touch anything you're not supposed to. You'll be fine." Famous last words. I grabbed the cart, a rickety thing loaded with boxed bandages and a spare oxygen tank, and headed out. The main halls were quiet, the usual hum of ventilators and distant voices fading as I approached the old wing's entrance. The double doors loomed ahead, their paint chipped and peeling, the caution tape curling at the edges like dead skin. A rusted chain hung loose, the padlock undone. Someone had been careless, or maybe intentional. I pushed through, the doors creaking on stiff hinges, and stepped into a hallway that felt like stepping back in time. The air chilled instantly, a damp cold that seeped into my bones, carrying the faint tang of mold and something sharper, metallic. The lights were dim, half of them burnt out, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked linoleum. Silence pressed in, thick and heavy, broken only by the squeak of the cart's wheels. The old wing was a mausoleum of neglect. I passed rooms with doors ajar, their interiors swallowed by darkness, dusty beds with sagging mattresses, IV poles tipped over like fallen soldiers, curtains hanging limp and gray. Some doors were sealed shut, their handles rusted, as if no one had touched them in decades. The walls were stained, yellowed with age, and in places I swore I saw faint scratches, like claw marks etched into the plaster. My breath fogged in the air, though it shouldn't have. The hospital's heat should have reached here. I told myself it was just the chill of an unmaintained space, nothing more. But my hands tightened on the cart, my knuckles whitening as I pushed deeper. Then I heard it, tapping, soft and rhythmic, like knuckles rapping gently on wood. It came from a room to my left, the door cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of shadow within. I froze, the cart rattling to a stop, my heart thudding against my ribs. "Hello?" I called, my voice thin and shaky, swallowed by the stillness. No answer, just the tapping, steady and deliberate, pulling me closer despite every instinct screaming to turn back. I edged toward the door, my sneakers scuffing the floor, and nudged it open with my shoulder. The hinges groaned, a low, mournful sound, and the room unfolded before me. It was small, barren, a bed stripped to its frame, a table littered with cracked vials, a single chair in the center facing the far wall, and there, stark against the peeling paint, were symbols in blood. They sprawled across the surface, jagged and chaotic, drawn in a rusty red that gleamed wetly in the dim light filtering from the hall. The chair sat perfectly aligned beneath them, as if someone had been there, staring, waiting. Half-burned candles ringed the floor, their wax pooled in blackened smears, long since extinguished. The air dropped, freezing, my breath clouding in thick plumes as I stood there, rooted. My mind raced. Vandals? A prank? But the blood looked fresh, too fresh for a place abandoned years ago. Then the tapping stopped, replaced by a voice. Low, whispering, brushing against my ear like a cold wind. "You don't belong here." I spun around, my pulse hammering, but the room was empty. Just me, the symbols, the chair. The temperature plunged further, the chill biting into my skin, and I felt it. A presence, heavy and unseen, pressing against me from every direction. My hands shook as I backed toward the door, the cart forgotten in the hall. The symbols seemed to pulse, their edges blurring as if alive, and the chair creaked, shifting slightly as though someone had just stood. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted, my sneakers slapping the floor, the tapping erupting again, louder, faster, chasing me from every room I passed. Doors rattled as I ran, their handles jiggling as if something inside fought to get out. The tapping echoed everywhere, behind me, beside me, above me, a cacophony of invisible hands pounding the walls. The hallway stretched endlessly, the dim lights flickering, plunging me into strobe-like bursts of shadow and glare. I reached the elevator, slamming the button with a trembling fist, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The doors slid open, and I stumbled inside, the cart abandoned somewhere in the chaos. As they began to close, the whispering returned, soft, insistent. "Don't leave yet." I jabbed the ground floor button, my reflection staring back from the polished steel doors. But it wasn't just me. She stood there, a figure at the hall's end, tall and thin, her face obscured, watching me with an intensity that turned my blood to ice. The doors snapped shut, and the elevator lurched downward. I spilled into the main lobby, nearly colliding with a security guard dozing at his post. He jolted upright, frowning at my wild eyes and heaving chest. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. I stammered out what I'd seen, the tapping, the symbols, the figure. He shook his head, skeptical. "Old Wing's been locked up tight for years. No one goes in there." But he humored me, pulling up the camera feeds. The hallway showed empty. No cart, no open doors, just stillness. Then the screen flickered, static buzzing, and for a split second, she appeared again, standing where I'd last seen her, her head tilted, watching. The guard cursed under his breath, but when the feed cleared, she was gone. I never went back. The next day, the old Wing's doors were chained again, the padlock gleaming new as if nothing had happened. I quit a week later, trading the hospital's shadows for college classrooms, but I couldn't shake it. I feel it still, waiting beyond the door, its presence lingering in the corners of my mind. At night, I hear the tapping, faint and distant, creeping through my dreams. I see the symbols, wet and red, and her silhouette in every reflection. The elevator, my car window, the bathroom mirror. She's patient, unyielding, a shadow tied to that forsaken wing. I don't know what she wants, what those symbols meant, or why they chose me, but I know she's still there, beyond the locked doors, whispering my name in the dark, and I'm terrified that one day I'll hear her call loud enough to answer.